I remember the smell of gasoline burning in the air, the orange light of late afternoon reflecting off the pumps, and the sticky feeling of my sweaty hands squeezing the hem of my old t-shirt. I was 12 years old, a backpack dropped at my feet, and one last look that my mother threw out of the car window before speeding off and disappearing down the road. I stood still, thinking it was a joke. I thought she was going to drive around the block, laughing, saying that I should learn not to throw tantrums or some stupid lesson like that. But then the sun started getting lower in the sky, the mosquitoes started attacking my legs, and time went by like a clogged sewer, slow, smelly, and inevitable. The attendant, a man with a dirty cap and cigarette teeth, asked if I was expecting anyone. I didn't know what to say. I said that my mother had gone to get something. He frowned as if he already knew, like he'd seen the scene before. I ended up in a small police station with peeling walls and a coffee machine that spat out something that looked like dirty water. A social worker handed me a thick blanket and a withered sandwich. They asked my name, my age, if I knew where I lived. I did, I just didn't know why I didn't seem to live there anymore. At first, I tried to protect her. I made up stories to justify it. Maybe the car broke down. Maybe she got lost. The truth is that deep down, I knew. Children feel these things in their bones, even when their heads try to deny it. I ended up in a temporary home, which in practice was an old house with a musty smell, and 17 other children trying to survive by screaming. I quickly learned that no one there cared about your sorrows. It didn't matter if you'd been dumped at a gas station, thrown out of a moving car, or simply forgotten in a shopping mall. Everyone there had their own scar, and no one wanted to see yours. Over time, the memory of that gas station became something of a blur in my head, a blur of sadness mixed with anger and shame, but there was a part of me that refused to forget it completely, a part that cataloged everything in silence, like a spiteful librarian. I went through 3 foster homes, 2 failed adoptive homes, and countless schools where nobody knew what to do with me, the girl from the gas station, the one who learned not to expect much from anyone. At 16, I ran away. I slept in shelters, worked as a waitress, lived in rented rooms with mattresses on the floor, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbor breathing. It wasn't heroism, it was survival, pure and raw. And then, against all the odds that the social workers bet among themselves behind my back, I got it. A high school diploma by force, community college funded by 3-night jobs and loans that seemed to squeeze my throat with every bill. I worked like a convict. Every penny was a trench. Every rent paid was a battle won. At 32, I had my own apartment. Small, but mine. A used car that never let me down, almost never, and a stable job at a local marketing company. Nothing was luxurious, but everything was solid. It was the kind of solidity you build up only after you've seen the ground disappear beneath your feet once, and then just when I thought life had finally left me alone, it reappeared. First, it was a message, an unknown number, no profile picture. "Hi, it's your mother. Can we talk?" I read that message as if I were looking at a dead bug on the road. I didn't reply, not on the first day, not on the second. It stayed there in my inbox like a live cockroach under a glass. 2 weeks later, another message. "I'm going through difficult times. Could you call me, please?" I felt the old wound throbbing, a twinge between anger and bitter pity that I didn't want to feel. I ignored it again, because life had already taught me that some things, if you poke at them, bleed all over again. But it didn't stop. Then came the missed calls, and the voice messages I refused to listen to. Except that one gray Sunday, while I was shopping at the supermarket, she crossed a line she shouldn't have. A thin, worn-out woman with disheveled hair and the look of someone who has already lost everything appeared on my doorstep, with a plastic bag in her hand and the same face I had saved, distorted and aged like a bad copy of an old portrait. "It's quick, I don't have anywhere to go," she said, her voice breaking like bruised glass. I wanted to slam the door in her face. I wanted my mouth to say a round, cold, cruel no, but my body stayed there, frozen, as if I were still 12 years old, still in that gas station, waiting for her to come back. What did she ask for that afternoon? A small favor, almost ridiculous in the way she said it. "Let me stay in your guest room for a while, just until I get settled." My guest room, which wasn't all that great, a cubicle with a single bed and a few boxes of old books. But the mere fact that she called it a guest room made me want to laugh in her face, because guests are invited, welcome, and she was anything but. I took a deep breath. I looked at her, and I let a rehearsed response form in my head, an answer that I still didn't know if I would have the courage to say. But what I didn't know at the time was that accepting or not was the least of my problems, because what came after that visit wasn't just a request for help. I let her in, not out of kindness or pity. It was more like a weakness, an old, ill healed survival reflex. That feeling that if I said no, some invisible part of me would break down for good. So I opened the door and she walked through, dropping the plastic bag on the floor, like someone dropping a suitcase full of sins. The apartment suddenly became small, as if all the air had been sucked into that thin, shrunken figure who sat down on the sofa without asking, looking around like someone visiting an abandoned museum. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. The silence dragged on, thick and uncomfortable, as I stood, keys still in hand. She looked at me with a rehearsed smile that barely lifted the edges of her mouth. I won't get in the way, I promise, just until I get my act together. Reorganize, as if it were possible to reorganize 2 decades of neglect with half a dozen words. I showed him the back room with a dry nod. I gave basic instructions, as if I were showing the house to a stranger who had rented it via the app. This is the bathroom. There's a clean towel in the cupboard. You've already seen the kitchen. I spoke as if each word was a favor taken away by force. She thanked me quietly, looking down at her feet. And at that moment, I realized she wasn't expecting gratitude, affection, or conversation. She was already beaten at the factory, like someone who knows they've passed every possible expiration date. That evening, I tried to carry on with my routine as if nothing had changed. I made my simple dinner, washed the dishes, and organized my backpack for the next day's work. But it was impossible not to feel her presence permeating the room, like old smoke that, no matter how many windows you open, never really leaves. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of light footsteps. She was walking around the house, perhaps trying to locate herself in a place that wasn't, and never would be, hers. I pretended not to hear. I turned to the other side of the bed and forced sleep to carry me away, at least for a few hours. The next few days were like living with a ghost who, from time to time, tried to remind me that she was still a person. She was too discreet, as if she was afraid of breathing wrong. She washed her own dishes, spent the whole day locked in her room, went for walks without an appointment, and came back with grocery bags that didn't smell of food. I avoided questions. I avoided conversations. I avoided everything. But the signs started popping up, small, almost invisible to anyone who didn't want to see. The medicine chest in the bathroom with more bottles than any healthy person should need, the deep circles under her eyes, dark as bruises, that no amount of walking outdoors was going to solve, and the way she stared at the open windows, as if considering jumping not to escape but to disappear. One evening, while I was pretending to watch some stupid program on TV, she sat on the edge of the sofa, like a child asking permission to exist. I wanted to try to explain, she began, her voice, the husky voice of someone who has swallowed too many wrong words in her life. I remained motionless, my eyes glued to the screen. She understood. She didn't insist. She got up slowly and went back to her little room, dragging the door with the care of someone who doesn't want to wake ghosts. It was easy to hate her at that moment, to hate the ease with which she was once again invading my space, my head, my history, but it was even easier to hate the fact that a part of me wanted, desperately, an explanation. At work, I started getting little things wrong. Emails half answered, reports sent with silly mistakes. My boss, a practical and impatient woman, called me in for a chat. She asked if everything was all right. I smiled and gave the standard answer. Of course, everything was fine. Nothing a good night's sleep couldn't solve. But the problem was that sleep, like peace, was increasingly becoming a luxury I couldn't afford. One afternoon, I came home early and found my mother sitting in the kitchen going through my old photo album. The few photos I had kept, hidden in the back of the cupboard, as if even they embarrassed me. She flipped through the pages with an irritating slowness, as if she were touching open wounds. She saw me coming and closed the album in a quick, embarrassed gesture. She didn't say anything. Neither did I, but that scene stuck in my throat, bitter and uncomfortable. The following Sunday, she disappeared for a few hours. When she returned, she was carrying a new bag, one of those from a church thrift store, and inside it were some worn-out dresses and an old jacket. That's when I realized that she wasn't trying to reorganize herself. She had nowhere to go. She had nothing, or anyone. It hit me hard. She wanted to stay. Not for a while, not until she got settled. She wanted to put down roots in the only place where she could still pretend there was a bond, no matter how rotten and decayed it was. And then, one rainy, gray afternoon, like the final scenes of a sad movie, she finally mustered up the courage to say what I had been dreading. I was thinking, she began, fiddling with the zipper of her jacket as if it were a prayer. Maybe we could split the expenses. I could get a part time job. It would be good for both of us. For both of us. As if there was an us between her and me. As if 20 years of abandonment could be summed up in a question of shared rent. I looked at her like someone who looks at a crack in the wall that starts out small, but that will one day bring the whole house down. I didn't answer straight away. I kept my silence like a knife hidden behind my back. Because one thing became very clear at that moment. She hadn't come looking for redemption. She had come in search of shelter, and this time the storm she was dragging behind her was going to take more than my nights of sleep. I should have said no. I should have nipped it in the bud, coldly and definitively, like pulling up a weed before it gets tangled up in what matters. But instead, I let things drag on. Day after day, I kept pushing the decision down, thinking that maybe if I ignored the problem hard enough, it would dissolve into thin air. It began to settle in the house like someone occupying a vacant lot. Little by little, silently, she expanded her space. A blouse left on the armchair, a jar of cheap butter in my fridge, a pair of old slippers in the bathroom. Small signs of permanence, like thin roots tearing up the concrete floor. There was no official conversation, there was no agreement. It was just one day after another, and before I knew it, she was already part of the landscape of my daily life, like a crooked painting that you stop noticing after a while. At first, I tried to ignore it. I concentrated on my work, my bills, the reports that piled up on my desk like sand in a storm. I made up imaginary appointments to leave the company later, to have fewer hours shared under the same roof. But the tension followed me wherever I went, a kind of invisible knot that tightened my chest even when I smiled at my colleagues or pretended to be interested in team meetings. At home, her presence was constant, but never exactly oppressive. She seemed to understand that she was occupying a space that didn't really belong to her. And perhaps that's what annoyed me the most. Her servile manner, her exhaustive caution, as if her every move was a futile attempt not to displease someone who was already hopelessly annoyed. I saw it in the smallest gestures. She never ate the last slice of bread. She always left the TV on at minimum volume. She never complained about the cold, even if she was wrapped up in a threadbare blanket on the sofa. It wasn't a sudden invasion. It was something more subtle, almost pious, as if she wanted to pay off an impossible debt. But no debt can be paid off like that. And each graceless kindness only widened the gulf between us. Gradually, my resentment went from being something sharp to something thicker, more viscous, a kind of silent disgust, directed as much at her as at myself, for having allowed everything to get that far. One night, tired beyond belief, I let it slip. This isn't a hotel. The sentence came out dry, sharp, before I could stop it. She looked up, startled, and mumbled something like, I know, I'm sorry, before shrinking back into her corner. I didn't feel any better afterwards, nor stronger, just emptier. And then, as if the universe thought the whole thing still needed an extra dose of irony, a brown envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to me. A collection notice, old debts, debts that weren't mine. When I confronted my mother, she swore she knew nothing about it, that she hadn't used my name to open accounts, that it must have been a mistake, but something in the way she looked away, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she fiddled with the hem of her shirt, told me otherwise. I knew it, just as I had known years ago standing at that gas station that she wasn't coming back. This time, I couldn't afford to pretend I didn't see. I started locking up my things. I kept documents, cards, everything that could be used against me. I began to silently plan the moment when I would have to do what I should have done on the first day, throw her out. But it wasn't that simple, not because she was difficult to deal with, but because in some perverse way, kicking her out would mean admitting, once and for all, that that rotten thread that still connected us had to be cut. And that maybe, just maybe, I was as broken as she was. The weeks dragged by in suffocating silence, and little by little, the apartment stopped being mine. It became a minefield, full of memories I never wanted to revisit, full of guilt, shame, and old hurts that I thought I'd buried deep enough. Until one morning, as I was getting ready to leave for work, she let slip the sentence that would change everything. I was thinking, if you put me on your health insurance, it would be easier for me to get my tests done, you know, considering everything that's happened. I did. I considered every inch of my patience crumbling in the face of that woman's audacity. That was it. The final line. The moment when the little that still held us together came crashing down. She didn't want shelter, she wanted annexation. And if I didn't do something soon, I was going to end up buried under the rubble of a story that was never my fault, but which, through inertia, I was allowing to become my responsibility. It was there, standing in the corridor with my bag in my hand and the metallic taste of indignation rising in my throat, that I knew the next step was inevitable. It took me 3 days to decide what to do. 3 days of eating badly, sleeping worse, and pacing back and forth in the small space I once called home. Everything I had built, every inch of my organized and secure life, now seemed contaminated by her presence, by the living memory of what I had tried to forget. On the morning of the fourth day, I sat with a cup of cold coffee in my hand, staring into the void, until a strange calm came over me. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was more like accepting a final diagnosis. This would never be a relationship. It would never be repaired. I couldn't save what never really existed. I picked up my cell phone, took a deep breath, and sent a simple message. We need to talk today. I'll be home at 7. Working that day was torture. Every angry client, every unnecessary meeting, everything seemed to amplify the weight I was carrying on my chest. And as much as I tried to focus on the reports and spreadsheets, my mind went back to what was waiting for me that evening. The truth was that, in spite of everything, I still carried a stupid vestige of hope inside me, as if at the last minute she was going to admit her mistake, apologize, show somehow that there was some forgotten love deep down inside. But I knew, I always knew. I got home as the sun was falling, painting the sky a dirty orange. I found her sitting on the sofa, wearing the same faded sweatshirt that looked like an extension of her own body. The smell of reheated coffee and cheap cigarettes permeated the air, and I felt a discreet nausea rise in my throat. I sat in the opposite seat, keeping the distance of someone who knows they need to protect themselves. She tried to smile, a fragile smile, full of cracks, and for a second I saw the shadow of the woman I might once have called mother. You know I didn't mean to get in your way, she began, her voice shaken. It's just that life has been hard on me, you know. I really tried, but things never worked out. I thought that here, we could try to start again. Start again. She said it as if we were playing Monopoly and not talking about my broken childhood, the nights I spent shivering in shelters, the birthday parties that never happened, the school calls that nobody answered. I lowered my eyes to my hands, watching the tiny tremors that I could no longer control. I need you to leave, I said, my voice so calm it scared me. I need my life back. She blinked rapidly, as if the words had been an invisible slap. I have nowhere else to go, she muttered, as if that were argument enough to bury all the past. The silence between us was so thick that it seemed to have a weight of its own. I know, I replied, but I didn't either, when you left me in that post. I saw in her eyes the spark of something that could have been shame, but it was hard to tell. Maybe it was just exhaustion. She tried to argue, to cobble together half-baked justifications about financial difficulties, abusive relationships, bad choices. But each word hit me like a blunt punch, unable to make an impact because the real damage had already been done so long ago. I was no longer the girl she abandoned. I was no longer the teenager who wondered what she had done wrong. I was the woman who survived without her. And now I was the woman who had to survive again, only this time against her. You have until the end of the week, I said, without raising my voice. If you need me, I can help you find shelter. But here it's no longer possible, she cried, a dry, ugly, undignified cry. And I watched in silence, without moving, feeling an indigestible mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I was finally making the decision I should have made long before. Sadness because, deep down, it was impossible not to feel sorry for someone who had lost even his own pride. The following days were a grotesque spectacle of apologies, pleas, and attempts at emotional manipulation. Sometimes she played the victim. Sometimes she was filled with false fury, trying to reverse the roles and paint me as the cruel and ungrateful one in the story. It didn't work. I stuck to my decision like someone holding a door against a storm. On Friday, when I came home from work, I found the room empty, the unmade bed, some belongings dumped in the kitchen garbage can, and a note scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. I'm sorry if I caused you any trouble. I hope that one day you'll understand that I tried too. I read the note once, twice, then crumpled it up and unceremoniously threw it in the garbage can. I spent that night sitting on the living room floor, hugging my own legs, listening to the breathing in the house return to its normal rhythm, without weight, without fear, without that ghostly presence shadowing my steps. But for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to cry for everything I had lost, for everything I had built alone, at the cost of carrying what wasn't mine. I cried until the tears dried on my face and exhaustion overcame me. When I woke up, the day was gray, damp, like an old towel forgotten on the porch. But somehow the world seemed lighter. I knew it wasn't the end, that carrying the marks of childhood wasn't like changing out of old clothes, that there would still be days when anger and sadness would visit me without warning, but I also knew that for the first time, I had chosen myself, and that from that moment on, anyone who wanted to be part of my life would have to come with clean hands. Some things don't end with slamming doors, screams, or dramatic endings. Some things simply rot slowly, silently, until what was left collapses quietly. Life went on without her, as it should have from the start, but it didn't get any lighter overnight. It took me weeks to undo the traces she left all over the house, my clothes and my head. Every little task felt like a futile battle, throwing away the cheap jar of margarine she bought, changing the sheet that still smelled of cheap cigarettes, washing the mug she used for the third time, even though she didn't want to drink anything out of it. It was as if she had left an invisible trail that was hard to erase. At work, I went back to being the focused professional that everyone knew, but something inside me didn't fit in the same way. I started avoiding happy hours, birthdays, any social gathering where colleagues exchanged family stories as if it were a simple, safe, guaranteed thing. I learned to smile and change the subject with elegance. I learned that not every absence needs to be explained. The nights were the worst. It was there, when the world outside was silent, that the voices in my head gained more space. They weren't accusations or explosive resentments. They were small, subtle, cutting questions. Did she ever think of me when she slept in a dirty bed? Did abandonment ever weigh on her like it did on me? I wanted to believe so. I wanted to imagine that some part of her carried a kind of true regret, even if it was never enough. But wanting is not the same as having. And the truth is that there was a huge gap between the mother I needed and the woman she was. One day, without planning it, I passed in front of a gas station that looked just like that one. The scene was almost comical. A brightly lit convenience store, rusty signs, the greasy smell of hot asphalt rising into the heavy air. I parked by instinct and stayed inside the car, watching the movement. I saw a girl sitting on the curb, fiddling with her cell phone, completely oblivious to everything around her. I wondered for a second if she was waiting for someone, if someone was coming. My throat tightened in a way that forced me to close my eyes. I took a deep breath, leaned my head against the steering wheel, and let the moment pass, like a quick summer storm that you know you can't stop. I didn't go downstairs. I didn't talk to anyone. I just pulled the car away and drove on, because I knew that this pain was no longer about her. It was about me. Over time, I learned to make peace with loneliness. I stopped seeing it as a punishment and started treating it like a silent house after a long war. A house with cracked walls, it's true, but it was still mine. My choices, my achievements, my mistakes, my path. The letter from the hospital arrived a few weeks later. A formal, cold letter addressed to me. They informed me that my mother had given my name as an emergency contact before being admitted, probably in a last-ditch attempt to cling on to some illusion of a family that never existed. Severe respiratory failure aggravated by years of neglect, addiction, and self-abandonment. I carried on living. I signed new contracts at work. I renovated the small apartment, changing furniture, colors, memories. I made new friends. I traveled to cities I'd never imagined I'd see. I relearned how to laugh, in a strange way at first, as if my body was wary of lightness. But it was real. It was mine. The years went by little, the memory of her became less sharp. It didn't disappear. It didn't become something beautiful or poetic. It just lost its power to paralyze me. Sometimes I still find myself thinking about what could have been. In another life, with other choices, perhaps we could have walked side by side. Maybe I would have had that mother who waits at the school gate, who decorates the first birthday cake, who holds your hand when you're scared. But wanting doesn't change what is, and that's what it was. A broken woman trying to suck the dignity she couldn't keep for herself out of her adult daughter. A daughter who, despite everything, has learned to survive, who, despite being abandoned, didn't turn to ash, who, despite being forgotten at a gas station as disposable luggage, chose to keep moving. Today, when I look back, I feel neither pride nor bitterness. I feel a strange gratitude for having learned all too soon a lesson that many people never learn. Sometimes the greatest demonstration of self love is simply saying no. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave your like and comment below.